So welcome to our podcast on China's first Protestants. I'm Dr. Anthony Clark. I'm the professor of this class. They'll introduce themselves and begin. I'm here with three wonderful students and at the table with me for this podcast, and a large group of students in the background who have been ceremoniously clapping for us to get us going. So thank you. I love that. All right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our History of Christianity in Asia podcast. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on the first Protestants in China. My name is Ashley Crawford. I'm a student here at Whitworth University. I'm studying secondary education, history, and theology, and I'm here alongside my friends and students.
I am Chloe Paparazzo, and I am majoring in history.
My name is Annabelle Hebden, and I'm also a student here at Whitworth. I am studying history and secondary education as well as theology, just like Ashley, and I'm very excited for tonight.
Yes, we're excited to dive into this conversation. Throughout the podcast, we're hoping to talk about the differentiation between the early Protestants with that of early Catholic missionaries in China. We're going to talk about the writing theology and the influence with evangelism in China. And we're also going to consider non-Christians' view of Christianity in China and the influence from China's first Protestants. So with that, let's dive into our first question.
So the first question that we have for you, we're going to go to Ashley, and we are going to look at how were China's first Protestants unique or similar in juxtaposition with Catholics in China?
Thanks, Annabelle. Yeah, we want to start with this question, not to be pitting Protestants or Catholics against each other, but because we want to see a bigger picture of the Christian influence in China. One of the most things we've heard from other podcasts before, we've learned about the Persian Nestorian or Church of the East, Christians that brought the gospel to China in 635. Later on, historically, the Franciscan missionaries came in the 1300s with Friar Giovanni, and then Jesuit missionaries like Matteo Ricci in the 1580s. Following that, the Protestant Reformation had a key influence in influencing the Catholic Reformation and push towards bringing Catholic missionaries, such as with Ignatius of Loyola and the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, into China. And from there, we see a distinction with the popes like Pope Clement and Pope Paul sending and dispatching Catholic missionaries to China, whereas more Protestant organizations like the London Missionary Society influencing Protestants, which we'll talk about primarily in our conversation, such as Robert Morrison. He came to China in 1807, and his partner William Milne, who came to China in 1814, 7 years later. They had a key role in coming to China as the first Protestants. They are from Scottish Presbyterian backgrounds. But what's also unique to consider is how they came after Catholics. And as a result, Catholic missionaries already had an established background in China, and there was some hesitancy to letting the Protestant missionaries into China because Christianity was illegal at the time. So when these first Protestants arrived, they had to wait for 30 years in Macau to get permission from the Ming Dynasty leaders to enter China, whereas Catholics had already been established in Beijing. So this is a key distinction to recognize. But we also want to point out how Protestant missionaries came into China because of the influence of maritime trade, such as the British East India Company, which employed Robert Morrison. So we see different groups that are influencing this. And we also, it's important to recognize how Christianity, like we said, it was officially forbidden at the time, from 1724 to the 1840s. So it's key to consider how China's first Protestants were coming about into China at the time when it was illegal. And another thing that we want to recognize is the distinctions of how Protestants and Catholics in the early missions approached missionary endeavors. For instance, the Jesuits like Matteo Ricci, we can see this more in some of the Chinese rights controversy, had more of a focus on accommodating and adapting to Chinese culture with tolerance and openness to Chinese morals, values, and ritual practices. Their evangelization had a top-down approach, focusing on the literate elite, and gaining respect in that way, addressing like Confucian elites, sharing advancements with indirect evangelization with science and technology and whatnot. With Protestants, we see them, they are studying Chinese, they are having new Chinese names, but we notice them wearing more English attire in some of their attire that they've been grown up in. But another key thing that overall that first Protestants in China focus on is language acquisition, scripture translation, and dictionary creation, which Annabelle and Chloe will talk about later on. The big thing here is the Chinese dictionary, and the Bible is translated into Chinese by Robert Morrison and William Milne. And this was also significant given that it was forbidden for foreigners to study the language according to Chinese law. Another thing that's important is considering the idea of success at the time. From the period of 1807 to 1820, Robert Morrison and William Milne had only 2 converts, but they made over 140,000 pieces of Christian literature. Compared to Catholic missionaries, by the date of 1305, they had 6,000 baptisms. And so when you think about numbers and success, that's very different. We look at that in contemporary numbers. By the 1950s and 1960s, 75% of all Christians in China were Catholic, but that's kind of been reversed now. And so I think this is just important for us to examine and consider the impact of Protestants and Catholic missionaries and their initial influences and how that's had a lasting impact, but also how it's changed over time. So with that, we're going to transition to our next question. How did Protestants writing theology, such as the publications in theology, influence missionary work in China?
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. So we see there's 2 British missionaries, as Ashley talked about, Robert Morrison and William Milne. They went to China with goals of mission and to evangelize. Robert Morrison was a pioneer for translation in Protestant China. Morrison's goal was to translate Christian texts into Chinese, and the publications of these texts allowed for a great number of men to read, and typically these were minority men. They would have not otherwise have access to these texts, so they prized themselves for this ability to have these texts, be able to read them, passing them down onto the children. Morrison even wrote that the poor must have the gospel be preached to them and written to them so that they can understand, because there was no filter down to them. Morrison made this possible with his 2 main writing projects. It was a multi-volume Chinese-English dictionary that was translating the Bible into Chinese, as Ashley said. The Chinese Bible was one of the biggest contributions to early Protestants in China and was particularly accessible with translations relating to the spoken Chinese language. Morrison's Bible was published in 1823 with the support and transcription of how do you say it?
Oh, goodness. Ashley, Annabelle is asking me how to pronounce something, and it's written in an old transliteration system, and I have no idea what that means. So I'm sorry I can't help you,
No,
even though I
you're
do
good.
speak Chinese.
He was the brother of one of the first Chinese Protestants to convert in China and was among one of the early Protestant converts. There were a couple of them. Morrison produced and distributed more than 10,000 tracts by 1813. A tract is typically a single page or a small booklet of religious texts, usually outlining theology and doctrine, and is meant to spread Christianity. In Morrison's case, he was prompting Protestantism in China. Morrison's first major work in China was a tract. This was named The Summary of Divine Doctrine Concerning Salvation. Within the 8-page tract, he covers topics such as sin, who God is, human nature, the law or the 10 Commandments, who Jesus is, and how he functions as the Savior, as well as what does it mean to live well and with Jesus. And then he ends with talking about prayer and how to pray well. Morrison also had to learn while translating the Bible how to distinguish between Chinese tradition and Christian tradition while using language that Chinese readers would understand. This is pretty typical when trying to bring Christianity to other cultures. So we see that there was a focus on sin. The word was repeated 19 times within the original tract, which was 8 pages long. We can see that Morrison used terms such as filial piety or merit, which reflects Buddhist and Confucian ideals, which brought a cultural understanding to Christianity and the text that he was writing. The Confucian way of thinking in China is very influential, and so Morrison uses those films so that the person can better understand what he's trying to say to them.
There's a lovely clicking sound in the background as another piece of technology is, I believe, dying. So anyway, continue.
Yes. So both Morrison and Milne wrote catechisms or texts about and explaining the Christian faith. which reveal a lot about theological and religious contexts. They, again, break down the Ten Commandments, but also what it means to read the Bible together and understand a pattern of law within the Bible. There seems to be a similarity between Christian textual theology and sects of Christian religions. Both alienate themselves from a corrupt society. They are close, tight-knit communities and both have salvation ideology that is paired with religious practices. This allows people in China to connect to some degree about what is being communicated to them about Christianity and also what it means to be a Christian. Morrison was a Calvinist, so his catechism follows a similar track as his tact, with some added topics including creation, scripture, Adam and Eve, church and ministry, baptism, the Lord's Supper, and much, much more. These topics are written in the form of questions, which ended up being over 103 of them, asking questions about each topic and what might be important about them, answering them. Robert Milne, we're going to switch to William Milne. He arrived in Macau in 1813 with his goal, different but similar goals, contrasting to Morrison. He wanted to start a seminary for the instruction of appropriate youth for the Christian ministry in China and nearby countries. Milne helped Morrison with his Chinese Bible and English Chinese dictionary, but then soon turned to education, establishing schools and texts for people to learn from. Milne's catechism was named Youth's Simple Explanatory Catechism. At face value, this does not seem like a Christian document. It has Confucian quotes within the pages, and the first book looks at pedagogy rather than faith instruction as Morrison's work did. Milne was used in first-generation missionary instruction and was often reprinted. The catechism is exceeding Morrison's with over 165 questions and is very in-depth. It is 37 pages, double pages long with a 4-page introduction. He looked at the importance of learning, respecting elders, moral propriety, as well as the Ten Commandments, who Jesus is, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. It is made to appeal to Chinese students and is personal and creative, whereas Morrison's is much more generic. Morrison and Milne wrote several documents together, including Two Friends, and newspaper articles where they often use pen names. And Two Friends is a fictional story published in 1819, telling the story of 12 meetings discussing Christian doctrine and theology, taking place between Chang and Yun, a Christian believer, and one of his neighbors. It is a conversation story of the neighbor. Two Friends is a literary hybrid, blending Chinese vernacular with catechetical missionary style from this time. The focus of the story is salvation from two men who grew up in 18th century revivalism. This story became so popular that several thousand copies were reprinted. The Chinese scholar believes that more than 2 million copies were closer to what went into circulation. This booklet was very easy to connect with because it followed two Chinese people having a conversation in Christianity in a very real way. While other tracts were not like this, it was also not translation of European text, which was standard at the time, but their own original works written in their own original Chinese, which appealed to Christian readers. This book was probably difficult for Mills and Morrison to write, as there were only 2 converts at the mission during this time, as Ashley said, but they also portray the neighbor as a person who travels often. These friends appeal to Chinese Christians when learning about friendship, evangelicalism, and how to prepare for the awkward questions that will definitely come up on their way to bring more Christians in. Tracts provide a lot of information for Christians, and yet there are only 2 converts during Morrison and Milne's time in China during their mission. They had lots of help from Chinese people, along with translation and language, but it makes me wonder how the mission in China is influencing those who are not in China or the non-Chinese in China.
You know, I want to just ask a quick question, but first, how are we doing for time?
14.
We're at 14 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, this is good. Now, there was a lot said there, and I know Chloe still needs to make some remarks. Annabelle mentioned a few things, and one of the things that actually you mentioned that I liked was this very gentle, not wanting to pit the Catholics and the Protestants against each other. And I think that's a lovely ideal. But historically speaking, there were problems at that time, right? So I'm thinking, you mentioned, you started by talking about Robert Morrison, and he goes to Macau and is promptly what? What happens to Morrison when he arrives in Macau?
He isn't received well, right?
He isn't received well by whom?
The Catholics.
The Catholics. They kick him out, right? So he has no place to stay.
Yeah.
So in one sense, there are a good number of tensions that are happening, but also a lot of similarities. But my question for all three of you then, just to think out loud here, is you mentioned 6,000 baptisms among the Catholics, and then you mentioned the 2 converts from 1807 to 1820 under Morrison. But then it was a lovely thing that you noted, and that is that the 75% Catholic, 25% Protestant inverted. Why would you suspect, originally there were so few Protestants and so many Catholics, and then suddenly you have this inversion, so many Protestants and so few Catholics. So what do you suspect was the cause of that?
That is part of some of my remarks. But
Well, maybe just preliminarily,
we discussed prior to this podcast that we think it has to do with the literature versus the conversion, that the Protestants were thinking more longitudinally, that this is going to continue. And so we need literature, because even though the people, we are not going to be here forever and we are going to die, our literature will continue.
Yeah.
And that legacy allows for a longer.
And then Annabelle mentioned this, that Morrison's first project was to write a tract. He's the one who produces this translation of the Bible, works on a dictionary. So 2 things happen, right? I love that you say that, Chloe. 2 things happen. One thing that happens is it establishes a foundation from which the Protestant mission can really effectively evangelize, and it results in a tremendous amount of success and converts. The other thing it does is it demonstrates to the Chinese literati, the local Confucians, who are book-based, it's a book-based culture, it demonstrates to them that these Westerners are also book-based people. Their literate adeptness attracts the Chinese, and I think it elevates the respect the Chinese have for Westerners because of this great amount of Protestant publication.
Most definitely. Those are great remarks. I think one more thing to add to that, you're wondering about the contemporary focus and shift for those numbers. I think with that comes the question of how much years are required for leadership roles within the church. When we look at the Catholic Church, there may be 6 to 8 years for the priesthood, versus Protestant churches, more contemporary, they may not have those requirements as much. So just considering the differences between the early first Protestants in China versus
So actually, I think you're suggesting that it takes less time to establish a community for a Protestant than maybe the Catholics who are studying philosophy and theology and taking quite a long time. Well, let's continue.
Yeah. So our third question that we have for you guys tonight is, I'm going to be asking Chloe. So Chloe, I'm curious, how has the mission influenced how non-Chinese people think about Chinese Christians?
I mean, a big part of this, and thank you, Annabelle, for asking that question, is that it has to do with synology and how synology started. Although Catholics were a major part of this and translating some of the classics of China, Protestants continued that legacy, even though, as Dr. Clark mentioned, there were some tensions between Catholics and Protestants, especially with the name. The translation of the name of God was a huge tension. However, the first Protestants were mostly focused on literature, as previously mentioned by Ashley, Annabelle, and Dr. Clark.
Wait, I'm sorry to do this, but
What?
to be fair, the Catholics fought among themselves about the name, and they fought with Protestants, but Protestants were more
But they were
congenial. They're
less-
like, let's just call God this or this. So there was more tension between Catholics and Protestants and Catholics and Catholics. I think the Protestants were much better behaved. Just that's what I'm trying to say.
I feel
Much
like
better
the
behaved.
Protestants were less willing to like learn from what the Catholics had learned prior.
Okay, all right.
It mentioned that in one of our books. So Robert Morrison and Mill published 140,000 pieces of literature while they were there. And a big part of this is also that the importance of early, or like, the importance of native Chinese speakers. I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce this correctly. Yang Sum Tak. Is that how you say that?
Yes, Yong, it's Cantonese, Yong San Tak, something like this.
Was
I don't speak Cantonese, so I can't be of much help.
oh no. Morrison's tutor. He was not Christian. It discussed in Sight's book, Protestant Missionaries in China, about how they had many theological discussions. And these discussions, even though Yang Sam Tak was not Christian, he actually enjoyed their conversations about theology and the importance of theology. And this also allowed for some cultural exchange between the two beliefs. And this allowed for people to go for Chinese interests to be in Europe, and specifically in Italy. Came to Italy through James Legge in 1878. And colonial projects had already came to China, so there was a little bit of that exchange because of colonialism. I'm trying to not repeat myself of other things that have already been mentioned. And then literature about Confucianism and other philosophies in religion.
You mentioned James Legge, and one of the largest studies that's ever been produced about Christianity in China was a book about Professor Legge, who was one of the founders of sinology in Oxford, Cambridge. He still is great English speaker, Protestant missionary. He still is considered among the very greatest of all time from any country. And any of us who study China end up reading Legge, even to this day, 2025. And that's part of this really impressive legacy. Well, I think we're great. What wonderful things you mentioned. But I want to bring up one thing and have all of you respond in our last few minutes. We have 5 minutes or so?
7.
7 minutes, okay. Just one last question. You mentioned, or you hinted at a few times, this issue of Chinese receiving Christianity, or Christianity being taught, and this attempt to evangelize Chinese people. There's a saying in China, 多一个基督徒便少一个中国人, which means one more Christian is one less Chinese. Can you say something about your thoughts? It's very negative, obviously, but can you say something about what how you think that these early Protestants they would have known this, by the way, might have approached preaching knowing of this prejudice? I love asking questions that people are not prepared to answer. It makes me very happy as a professor.
Probably with caution but also curiosity, because if you're being told you're no longer Chinese if you become a Christian, well, what does it mean to be a Christian, but also what does it mean to be Chinese? If they are different, why are they different? And why does the preaching separate those two things? I think we've talked about in class how people were curious, but also, why are you here? What are you trying to do here? they were a little apprehensive because
You mean the question toward the missionaries?
yes,
Right.
is why are these missionaries here apprehensive, not really sure how to receive them?
Mm-hmm.
Also, they're putting in their own like Buddhist and Confucian ideas into Christianity. I don't really know. I feel like it would have been very interesting to be living there during this time and trying to understand what is happening.
Let me ask Ashley, what do you think that using the terminology of Buddhism or Confucianism as a Christian, do you think this is helpful or creates more problems than it resolves?
By even just saying those words.
By using them to express Christian ideas, to use Buddhist terms, do you think that is helpful or problematic?
It definitely can go both ways. I think in the long term it can be more confusing, especially if you're trying to understand what is happening. I think there's a key emphasis on being able to have cultural context and relating to people in their context and where they're at.
Yeah.
Being able to use words and see similarities. I think that's where it's beneficial to see similarities between Buddhism or different terms that relate to that. But I think using those specific terms exactly could bring some distortion where people may not fully understand what it means or may be confused about, is this Christianity, is this Buddhism, and have a mixture of that.
Right, I think that's a good point. And also, it really does help us all to nod toward the problem of translation. Because if there has never been Christianity there, then how do we translate religious terms without relying upon other religious terms? And I think that's a natural instinct. Do you have any thoughts about this problem of cultural identity and evangelization, Chloe?
Well, I think it's a difficult issue because, especially with Buddhism and Confucianism coming into it, even though there was like Confucianism as a philosophy in our religion, and of course with the rights controversy would be the best example, but when talking about Protestantism, that's a little different because just it's difficult to reconcile certain cultural practices that may seem like idolatry, especially with Confucian rituals and ancestors, and where does it cross a line from this is just honoring your ancestors to this is now a worshiping and idolization of your ancestors.
Chloe, I like how you moved us out of translation into the realm of practice, right? That is, moving from text and language to here's a religious practice. Is it acceptable within the Christian context? That's a very, very good segue. Well, my last little comment really is one about how much in debt China is to the Protestant educational mission. I know that Annabelle, you suggested this a bit, or at least you mentioned it, was that there was a great deal of emphasis on teaching, and that culture of teaching not just the elite, but teaching the masses really did engender a much larger population of literate Chinese people. And that's directly related to the Protestant mission. Well, thank you, all three of you. Class, thank you. Awesome.